My name is DawaLokyitsang. I am right now at the University of Colorado Boulder. I just finished my candidacy examination for the PhD, and right now I'm in preparation for going to actually conduct my field research so that I can have a dissertation and finish it. So I'm specifically studying the development of exile Tibetan school system and their impacts on the latter generations. So that's what I'm doing right now. So when did I come to the United States? I was not part of the 1000 group. My father was. But soon after, my father was able to engage the family reunion procedures, and me, my mother, and my siblings arrived, I think, between 94 and 95. At the time, I had just finished 4th grade, so I was entering 5th grade, and so I guess the procedure of, I actually don't remember that much, because I think at the time I was 10, and then I had younger siblings who were even younger. I just remember going to Delhi and being told that we were going to be interviewed at the embassy. But I don't remember any of the bureaucratic procedures because I wasn't part of it. My father and my mother had pretty much figured that all out. I just remember going to Delhi. I just remember being told at some point I was going to be leaving for the United States. And as a kid, I don't remember it that much just because there was way too many new things happening. So I think my memory is blurry due to the fact that I was overloaded with old and new memories altogether. But what my friends tell me in Dharamsala is that apparently I was very excited and was showing off to them, saying that I was going to go to the United States. At the time, the U.S., this is the early 90s, so this is when the U.S. was doing really well economically and politically, I would argue. So the United States were a representation of a utopic modernization, modern society that, that we were, that came across as a fantasy land, across from the TV. As far as that, we got very little information at the time. So, the information we got of U.S. was through the movies and the kind of advertisement that was available on TV. So it looked like a fun place to do fun things, especially for kids. So I was excited about actually amusement parks. That was only in the U.S. at the time. So I remember going to the embassy with my mother and my siblings alongside other Tibetans who were part of the family reunion procedure. And the entire time was just me spending most of the time just playing with my siblings. It was just a fun time to not be at school, and there were other kids there. And I just remember doing a lot of kid things, basically. So I remember being at the embassy, but I don't remember the details of it just because most of my time was spent actually playing with other kids who were also there waiting for their papers, I guess. So that's what I remember of the embassy. And then after that, everything happened really fast. I guess we had gotten the papers and we were supposed to leave. At the time, even though the whole community came to say goodbye to us, family and family friends, and I don't think I realized at that age that I was leaving for good. So to me, it was going to be a new adventure. It was going to be lots of fun, and it was going to be vacation. So I was excited to leave at the time, and this is from a framework of a 10-year-old. So, and then, I remember the flight we took was Air France, and the flight was fun because, the flight attendants had toys ready for us. So I also enjoyed the free toys and games that we were able to play on the plane and the endless amount of movies. So the entire time I was kind of, I just thought I was going on a new adventure, and that's exactly how I felt about it. I don't remember the arrival that well, but I do remember my father being there alongside other fathers who were waiting for their wives and kids. And I remember the drive from the airport. I arrived in Boston. At the time, my dad had an apartment ready for us in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I remember the drive from the airport to Cambridge and thinking it was very big. And remember seeing the big buildings. It just all felt really new and exciting. So that's what I remember about the arrival stage. And then, for about 2 or 3 weeks, my dad was working on paperwork to get us into the public school system. My dad had specifically chosen Cambridge at the time because, according to his research, Cambridge had a really high standard of public education due to the fact that you had Harvard and MIT and a high class of community living there, so the tax money was good. So the public school system was as a result, was at a high caliber. So that's what I found out from my dad later, why he decided to have us live in Cambridge in an apartment rather than go out in the suburbs to buy a house. Many other families did that later on. But he felt like the school districts were not as strong. Going to school. My siblings and I were put into different elementary schools. I went to one that was specifically between Davis Square and Harvard Square. And my siblings, 3 of them went together to another public school in East Cambridge. So I was alone from my family entering elementary school. I don't think now that I think about it, I'm realizing I was entering in an entirely new socio-cultural political realm. Of course, at the time, I didn't see it that way. I just thought I was entering a new space, even though there was a big language gap. Also, I wasn't fluent in English. So I just remember being very quiet the first few months I was there. I had entered the school system in the middle of the school year, and I was entering 5th grade. And even though I wasn't necessarily a quiet kid, I just remember the first few months having to be very quiet due to the challenge of language. And I remember feeling anxiety, but I didn't really necessarily realize the anxiety had to do with the fact that I couldn't communicate with other kids. But, kids connect on other levels too, on the playground and during gym class. I was a very physical, I loved being physical as a kid. Like, I was very active. So through kind of non-communicative social, processes, I was able to, communicate in other ways and slowly started developing a friendship. I think that time of that stage of my life, it's kind of hard to recall just because I think it was like so many, it was no longer the case. I was entering an entirely new society and culture, and even down to the details of how people communicate was different. So I think because I was trying to accommodate all of these new experiences and new environments and spaces that I was entering, I think I was busy just analyzing what was going on around me. So I think as a result, I don't have like high caliber memories of every detail of my first few months in America. But what I do remember is at some point, I remember one time, I don't know what it was, I was upset about something, and I basically packed up my things and went back to my parents and told them, okay, I'm ready to go back. I'm done. Like, it was fun, but I'm ready to go back. And they were like, what are you talking about? And I was telling them, yeah, I miss my friends. I miss the neighborhood that I grew up in. I miss the familiarity. Of course, I didn't articulate it in those terms. I just mostly said that I missed my own friends and the kinds of activities I used to engage with them in. And my parents had to tell me, actually, this is home now. You're staying here for good. And I think that was a very shattering moment for me. That's when I realized I had actually said goodbye to everything I knew for good. And like everything unfamiliar that I had been dealing with up until that point, it had gone from really exciting things to like really confusing things. So I think I was really shocked that this was going to have to become the norm. So that was when I realized I was going to be living in America for good, and had to adjust emotionally and mentally to it. I think I almost felt cheated by my parents. I'm sure that they will recall it differently than I am recalling it. But at the time, I just remember feeling like, oh, I thought it wasn't really serious that we were going to move. I just thought we were going to go on a new adventure, and I, at some point I was going to get tired of it and then want to go back. And so I think after that moment, I had to basically enter a new reality in my head, as far as getting adjusted to the fact that this was going to be my life now. So I remember that part. So I don't know if that's enough for personal memory about coming and acclimatizing.
Yeah, that's fine. And now, if you can build on your education, how you got to your position here.
Yeah. So I went to the public school system in Cambridge from elementary school, middle school, up until high school. And then I decided to pursue college, not because I felt inspired by education or whatnot. I never really thought of myself as a person who was interested in an educational trajectory in life. I actually wasn't that interested in it. I think I was more interested in dancing at the time. That was my passion.
Did your parents speak Tibetan too? Were you speaking Tibetan in your family?
Yeah. So we spoke Tibetan at home, and that was my dad's rule. Even though I would argue that it was a losing battle because there was four of us, four kids, versus them, and whenever they weren't around, we were interacting in English most of the time. And that wasn't necessarily, I think it was a mixture of habit, because we spent most of our time at school socializing with other kids, and there you're required to speak English. If you speak anything else, people think that you're actually speaking badly of people. So we weren't allowed to speak in anything besides English there, because it was a marker of difference, and at the time that was not very much in style. And in our neighborhood, we played around with other kids. We actually grew up in a very diverse, small neighborhood in Cambridge. There were other communities of color and immigrants there, I would say, but also you had African Americans and I would say lower scale, upper middle, like lower to working class white communities also around. You had people who owned houses versus apartment buildings in the vicinity. So we played around with the kids, and our common language was English. So and our friends, neighborhood friends, required that we speak English. Otherwise, they felt like we were cheating in the game or possibly talking about them. So the social environment that we were in outside of the home reinforced English speaking onto us. And I don't think we necessarily made active choices on whether we should be speaking English or Tibetan. It was your child, and your only concern is being able to play and socialize in that sense. So English was a natural language that, we didn't think twice about. And I think because of this habit within the house, we were always speaking to each other in English, despite my parents' dedicated assistance, assisting that we actually speak in Tibetan. So we would do it in front of them because they were demanding that out of us. But when they weren't around, we mostly spoke to each other in English.
So you were speaking that you were interested in dance, and then.
So I was when I was younger, at the elementary school and middle school, there were after-school programs that were available, but for a price. And I used to always sneak into these like after-school programs just because they just looked fun, and I gravitated towards dance and gymnastics actually. And the program coordinator for the after-school program would see me often just kind of like watching the other kids. And I remember she asked if I was interested, and I said I was, and but I wasn't aware that it was for a certain, like each class was for a certain price. And I don't actually remember discussing finances with her, but I remember she said like if I was interested, I can go ahead and participate in these after school programs. And so she had made me sign an application, which I took to my parents to get signed off on. And this really nice lady was not charging me for it, which I learned later because I thought these classes were free actually. I found out later that they were actually for a price. So I started doing gymnastics and dancing, and I was really into that. So at the time, I thought that was going to be my passion. And at the time, I think Dominique Dawes was really popular, and my dad used to ask me like, what do I plan to do with these after-school activities? Because he could tell that I was more into them than my homework, for example. And I used to say, like, I'll become famous. I'll become a famous gymnast and then talk about Tibet. That was going to be my contribution. Of course, this is again through the framework of a preteen. So my parents didn't necessarily discourage or encourage my after-school curriculums. They were just like, whatever, you enjoy them. And so, yeah, I was not very interested in the school materials. I never really thought of myself as a smart student, but I didn't necessarily think of myself as a dumb student either. I just was like, I have to do this because this is what they tell us and this is what we're supposed to be doing. So I did it because that was the norm at the time. So even going to college wasn't necessarily wasn't a question. I think my father had, for my dad, it was always, actually both of my parents, but I would say my dad more than my mother, was always emphasizing education. But I think that's in general, when you're in a Tibetan community, that's highly emphasized as an avenue for being an agentive force in the larger Tibetan goals, whether it's about community or politics. So education was never up for debate. So I never necessarily thought of it as a debate. I went to college, also like treating school as if it's a regular part of life. That's something that I have to do. Felt like work more than anything else. And and it wasn't until maybe like my second year in college that I started taking it seriously. And not because I took school seriously, it was because I started taking specific subjects. I started taking courses in humanities, specifically on Native American history, history of European Industrial Revolution. I was reading the Communist Manifesto. These were required courses that I started slowly to I started becoming interested in these subjects. But at the time, I was not motivated due to academic excellency. It was mostly motivated by the fact that I was highly involved in Students for a Free Tibet on campus. I was part of the chapter, and I was also I was the president. I later on became the president of the school chapter. I went to University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then later on I took on the responsibility of becoming the regional officer for the New England region of Students for a Free Tibet chapter. And because of my activism interest, I started taking a more intellectual interest in these larger historical movements that have shaped social justice discourses. So at the time, I was more interested in it for ideas about social justice and political mobilization. And so I decided to pursue a degree at the time in this new field, an interdisciplinary field called social theory and political economy. And that basically opened up the interest of social sciences to me, and how we can interpret politics and historical phenomena through those frameworks. And I found it to be really interesting and eye-opening. Of course, that didn't necessarily inspire me to be an academic in life. I still didn't think I was going to be an academic. I got my bachelor's degree because that was what was expected out of me from my parents and the Tibetan community. And for the first thing I actually did was go back to Dharamsala the minute I was done with this educational trajectory, like from primary school up until you graduate college. You know, school is the norm of life, and you don't question it. And after college, that was the first time I was feeling like I really wanted to be in a completely Tibetan environment. I had been away from the Tibetan community for too long. And when I say Tibetan community, I mean the social, environmental, linguistic, cultural landscape entirely in the Tibetan space. And that's what I missed most about my childhood in the Tibetan community in Dharamsala. So I just wanted to go back and be in a Tibetan environment where being a Tibetan didn't have to be something that I needed to, do or like invoke. It was something that was unquestioned and assumed, and that was going to be in Dharamsala, returning to the community that I had come from. Before that, my dad had actually sent me to Dharamsala when I was 15. This is when TCV had just began its summer program for Tibetan kids abroad. So that was actually my first time returning to Dharamsala. And I had spent the summer studying basic Tibetan lesson plans in Upper TCV in Dharamsala. And I also, at the time, I had actually wanted to stay and finish up, I think, 11th grade in Dharamsala, but my father was against the idea. He thought that I was actually, he told me that I was coming back and actually finishing high school in Dharamsala. He didn't like the proposition that I made about spending 11th grade in Dharamsala and then eventually returning to finish high school in the States. So I ended up reluctantly coming back, but then I told myself at the time that I was going to come back, and I was going to come back for a longer period of time. So in 2007, I graduated from college, and I told my I told myself this was the time that I can go back for an extended period of time. And this was before the Tibet Corps, or there was no structure or system put in place at the time to cater to uh, young Tibetans who had grown up in the States or outside of the Tibetan community in South Asia, uh, to come back and you know not reintegrate but interact with the Tibetan community there. And so what I wanted to do was actually go back to the Tibetan community, and I was ingrained with the idea that of the idea about social volunteer social services. The like Peace Corps comes from that idea of like needing to go in a community and be a change there. So I had internalized that idea, and I was thinking, okay, well, I'm going to go back to the Tibetan community in Dharamsala and find a way to contribute, which I think is a really ambitious idea now that I think about it. But I was thinking of it at the time because that was the social protocol. So I thought I could go to Dharamsala and contribute, my expertise, which now sounds ridiculous. But I went to Dharamsala, and I decided to offer my services in English to newcomers at this volunteer organization in Dharamsala at the time. This is in 2007. And I also offered my services to the Department of Information. Now it's the DIIR, which stands for Department of International Relations. I'm blanking right now, but at the time they were specifically working on finding out the policy and structural developments happening inside Tibet, and they were the branch that informed CTA. At the time, it was Tibetan Government in Exile. It hadn't transitioned to Central Tibetan Administration yet, and I at the time they told me they published yearly articles on new developments in Tibet, and I told them I had been trained in social theory and political economy, and at that time environmentalism was just happening in the West. This is before they started actually considering human culture and ecology. So this was specifically they were specifically motivated by environmental degradation that had nothing to do with humans. And so because of this larger global direction, the DIIR at the time was also interested in specifically environmental damages happening in Tibet due to Chinese infrastructural development. I told them that I was not a specialist in infrastructural development or environmental science, but I would be able to work on something that took a more human approach. I told them I could actually try and see the infrastructural development through the frameworks of how it was impacting human culture, so Tibetan communities along these infrastructural paths. And even though that's not what they were looking for at the time, they were receptive. So I specifically worked on trying to see how the structural developments taking place in Tibet was going to impact the Tibetan community by looking at similar cases, case studies in Aboriginal communities in Australia and the Native Indian communities in the U.S. Specifically, at the time they were finishing up the Qinghai to Lhasa railway. So I was looking specifically at railway infrastructural development on like indigenous owned land. So and their impacts on the communities there. So I specifically worked on that. And I was working at the DIR and also teaching English on the side in Meklod, and but I think mostly I just wanted to just be in a Tibetan environment because it had been a very long time. And that was a very eye-opening experience. What I came away from that was that rather than me provide services for the Tibetan community in this, in the manner that I thought at that time, I actually walked away feeling like I gained a lot from that experience. And the fact that, 6 months to CTA is not going to be that much service offered as opposed to people who've been there for like 30 years. So if anything, I walked away feeling very humbled by the experience and realizing if I actually want to be effective for the Tibetan community, I need to actually invest in myself and figure out how that was going to impact, find out how that was going to also be useful for the larger community. At the time, I was still not really interested in grad school, even though my dad was very adamant about it. Instead, I actually ended up working for the NGO CTEC. This is a specific organization funded by the Dalai Lama Foundation. They specifically did work with Himalayan indigenous communities who are Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, and they were using these funds to specifically help these Himalayan border communities sustain their culture and language. So I was basically working as an office assistant, doing a range of office managerial work, but also researching these communities to kind of figure out the kind of projects that would be most useful in the long term for them. So one of the programs actually, like, they also worked on developing schools in the specific locations. Prior to that, they had, for example, TCV had made room for these Himalayan region kids to come and study at the boarding school. One of the things that the communities echoed over and over again was the fact that taking them away to boarding schools in Nepal, like Pokhara, Kathmandu, or Dharamsala, although it was very useful in giving them modern education, the thing that they were struggling with most was when these kids came back, they lost their language, like local dialect was no longer a strong, like, they didn't necessarily have access to that language as opposed to when they left. So they also, some of the things that they were asking for was actually developing schools on the location rather than having to send away kids far away. And as a way to safeguard local language, histories, and local ecological knowledge that was very important for the development of these communities, for being able to sustain themselves in the future. So I worked for that organization for about a year. And then after that, I actually decided to go back to Dharamsala and study at the Sara College for Higher Tibetan Studies, because I felt like my spoken and written and writing understanding of Tibetan was very poor. The last time I had studied Tibetan on the regular was in 4th grade. So even though I got access to Tibetan education during Sunday schools at the Tibetan community in Boston, it's really hard to say that, I think like everything I learned we would learn Tibetan reading and writing for 2 hours every Sunday. But then I would go back and spend, 95% of my time back in my school system, which is entirely in English. I would forget the lessons I learned for 2 hours at a time over the course of a week. So it was, as far as retaining and maximizing on my basic Tibetan, I would say I had basic alphabets intact, but going to the point of being able to write essays and understand comprehensive Tibetan vocabulary was out of the question. So yeah, after I finished working in New York for CTEC, I decided to go invest in strengthening my knowledge of Tibetan. So I went to Sara, which is located in Lower Dharamsala, and I studied there for about 2 years. My sister joined me for the first year. My dad was actually the one to say, "Hey, would you be interested in accompanying your sister to Sara?" Because it was her first time going back to Tibet. For me, it was going to be my third time. So I went with my sister, and my sister stayed for about 10 months. And originally I was also supposed to stay only for 10 months, but I decided to stay another year because during that time, I also started developing an interest in Tibetan history. And that's when I started to slowly realize maybe I wanted to go back to school and do grad school. And so I decided to stay another year to pursue Tibetan studies, but also prepare for GRE examination and application process. And so that's when I joined. After Sara College, I had gotten into University of Colorado Boulder at the anthropology department, and I decided to pursue cultural anthropology. So this was in 2011. So I finished my master's, and I decided to stay and pursue my PhD. And so that's my educational professional trajectory. I mean, the resettlement project story is obviously a personal story for me, because that's how I got here. Despite the fact that, when I was younger, I wanted to return. But I don't necessarily have a conclusion for how I feel about, my trajectory, but what I can speak on is the personal experiences and personal observations of people who moved here, families who shifted here from the settlements in India and Nepal, and the developing scholarship on this topic. And I would say ultimately this was seen as a positive move. In the beginning, it looked like the Tibetan government had high hopes for this move because it was going to be in addition to the trajectory of exile as an entire project, from developing schools to developing settlements to being able to further that trajectory into professional development. And in many ways, it looked like the Tibetan government saw this as a avenue for Tibetans to develop themselves further in the realm of politics, education, and professionalism. At the time, there was a desire for doctors, nurses, teachers. The possibilities for professional trajectory was endless at that time, and the U.S. was moving to the West was a part of this, larger imagination for what the future could possibly offer. But it was also thought in the realm of how was this trajectory going to have a positive impact for what we want to do for Tibetans at large. So this was very much motivated by, what this could mean for, what this could mean in positive ways for the Tibetan community at large, and how can educational possibilities and larger avenues for political mobilization going to help Tibetans inside and the evolving exile situation. So in many ways, this project was motivated by a lot of, positive ideas around community, politics and responsibility. And so, you can't really argue against that kind of motivation. It was enmeshed in larger ideas about our responsibility towards each other in Tibet. And this story is something that echoes again and again when you talk to the first 1,000 that arrived. People like my father maintains that motivation and has motivated me to stay on that path, regardless of personal interests. And I think I thank him for that, because it has also given me a sense of direction and purpose, despite wanting to separate and develop my own identity at some point. But ultimately, that was the larger goal, and I think those are very, selfless kinds of goals. And so, what did it result in? I will say that when I was a teenager, I questioned it a few times. I remember, I think the first 1,000, when they were together, they had a lot of positive memories. When you ask them about early memories, the kinds of memories that they share is a lot about struggling together, putting in work together, helping each other out, forming this community, which became Tibetan Association of Boston, for me at least. And a lot of it was stories of triumph and struggle that was possible because there was this motivation to do it together, and this ease with being able to help each other out without even having to ask. So, even though the first few years for 1,000 was marred with a lot of cultural shock and understanding American work culture, for example, it was also filled with a lot of stories about each other and helping each other out. It was a story about love and struggle, I would say. And then, Tibetan families, the resettlement project started, family reunification program started, and, Tibetans started to have families in North America and in Boston. Like, the community I know intimately, since from back in those times, is the Boston Tibetan community and the New York Tibetan community. And, when families started arriving, it was exciting because, people had not seen their family. Some people hadn't seen their family members for 5 years, and it was exciting for them to be able to have their family here now, and then fully invest in whatever dream that they have for their family, whether it aligned with larger Tibetan, goals of the future or not. And in many ways, we call it a Tibetan community in Boston, but we didn't necessarily have what we had in India. We didn't live in a pocket-sized community where the school, workplace, marketplace, playground space, all of these social spaces were Tibetan, essentially, in these settlements in India. As opposed to America, you're not entering a settlement. People are trying to find, locations where they can afford to have a family for the paycheck that they were getting. Most of these 1,000 were doing, manual labor-centered work. And it's not a lot of pay, without any guarantees of benefits. A lot of work that offered benefits disappeared eventually by the end of the 90s. So they were working with really challenging socioeconomic landscape. And as a result, we lived in really scattered pockets of Massachusetts. And then when we could be community, it was usually through community events for like Tibetan New Year's, commemorating Tibetan March 10th. These were spaces where we could actually be community together, momentarily spend time, energy, space, and bodily, connections together. But, they weren't regular. And it's not to say I didn't appreciate those spaces. I loved those spaces. It was the only space where I could find, where I could be Tibetan momentarily. Not all the stories of family reunification is a good story. It didn't necessarily work out for some families. And for me, like a lot of the issues of why it didn't work out for some people it has everything to do with, arriving in a totally new society and trying to figure it all out from day one. Like you're not just trying to figure out language here, you're trying to figure out symbols and signals of an entirely new culture, and being misunderstood, feeling invisible. And, a lot of that turned into mental issues that came out in different ways for some people. And so, alongside seeing it as a positive impacts, they were also side effects. It wasn't perfect, and I remember a lot of people being depressed, a lot of older Tibetans, some of them dying from their depression, getting cancer. Like it's very, at that time, we didn't have the language for explaining these issues. A lot of these issues were blamed on personalized, individualized histories, but now there's the language for how socio-environmental alienation can impact individual mental health and how that can contribute to how you socialize in your family, let alone a community. And I think in the larger holistic frame of things, these were contributing factors for why it didn't work out for some people. For some people it did, and for some people it didn't. And it had a lot to do with the fact that you didn't live in a Tibetan community. But for me, in the long run, that actually made me understand why the struggle for a free Tibet, for example, the struggle for us to be able to return home, which was always the goal, even since 1959, was more urgent. When I saw these, I interpreted these episodes through the larger framework for what happened to Tibet as a whole, due to the Chinese invasion, but also why it was important for us to stick to the original goal, the political goal of returning, because some of these issues were highly related to that. So I saw people struggling through it, and yet trying to still be relevant and useful for the larger goals of Tibet, politically speaking. So it was some good times and some difficult times that I observed. Not everybody made it. Like some people fell through the cracks. Some people died from depression and stress and anxiety and etc. And I think some people who made it through like as a family intact are extremely aware of what they went through. So from a scholarly point of view, I've always tried to understand this phenomena because, when I was a teenager, I always was like, was this a good idea? Like there was a lot of positive motivations that I couldn't deny. But as a teenager, when I saw families break apart and people become sick and several people die from it, I was just like, is this worth it? And I don't know. I don't have the answer for it, but I do remember questioning it as a teenager. But but like I said, that also helped me understand the need to find a solution for Tibet politically was. I saw it also through that framework, so it helped me understand it better. But yeah, I think the motivation was, I don't think I was the only one going through this. Like, I was observing it, and then asking myself questions, but I think for people who were actually going through it, they were. I don't know what they were thinking because I can't be in their head, but I do think that Tibetan community, the idea of the larger Tibetan community, the fact that the history of exile and the history of efforts of the Tibetan government were also things that also momentarily motivated them, definitely. And that's what I mean. I think at the time it was like very challenging to see it through the frameworks of, what does this mean? Is this worth it on the larger communal scale, a larger political scale, versus the scale of your family versus the scale of your mental health? And I don't necessarily think you have to choose one of the scales. I think all of it was present, and I think that many of the times, one of the reasons why people got through some of it was, it might not look great right now, but ultimately this was the vision that the Tibetan government had, that the Dalai Lama had, and trying really hard to hope that was going to be the result, and I think it also became a framework for a lot of people and families as a way to pull out of these tough times too. But not everybody pulls through. I'm just trying to be realistic about the fact that it worked in some ways and it didn't for others. Others were working with even more difficult circumstances than people who were able to pull out of it. At the end of the day, you needed a strong community that was present at all times and a strong family that could actually, factor into a strong individual. Well, anthropologists would actually say don't do comparative analysis because it doesn't really get to what these communities are going through and experiencing, because they're not seeing it in comparison to, for example, the Vietnamese refugee experience or the Cambodian experience. They're not even aware of it, actually. I think what's interesting is, statistically speaking, number-wise, it is hailed as one of the most successful, refugee transition program, and you can credit a lot of that to numbers, but also we are a smaller number compared to these other refugee communities. But also, I think stereotypically we make for a really good story. But I'm trying to say that transition isn't easy. Being ripped apart from your home for the second time is not easy. It is extremely difficult. And I think what I'm saying is like Tibetans, just like people who've been removed over and over again and never given a sense of rootedness or permanence, went through very similar kinds of alienation and emotional and mental breakdown because of these situations. But I think something that motivated Tibetans was actually the collectivizing role that His Holiness plays, the fact that we could actually have this ideological thing called a collective community, and it wasn't even a question. These were spaces that actually operated as spaces that could actually momentarily heal people for a little bit. And also, these were actual communities that, were physically able to try and help despite these really difficult circumstances. I think it's unfair to say that they're successful just because they're Tibetan. I think there are so many factors that go into the fact that these are humans, who are experiencing entirely human circumstances. And one of the things that they were able to latch onto that helped people and communities was this idea of a community that had developed in exile. But also the experience of living in an intact community in settlements of India, for example. I think the memory of community actually motivated this idea of a community that couldn't physically exist, but, the idea could collect us at moments throughout our time to be with each other and feel like a community and be motivated by that. Those things are real. And I think I would credit that to be one of the very important factors for how Tibetans were able to survive their circumstances in the States, for example. From a scholarly point of view, I've tried to understand this, what I grew up in and witnessed through a more holistic approach, because I seriously had doubts when I was a teenager. I'm not going to lie about that. And what some of the things, some of the scholarship that I was reading, which came out later in the 2000s, is that, one of the things that the Tibetan exile community experienced was a large brain drain. They called it a brain drain because the lottery system was based off of a lottery system for 1,000 that was going to come over here. But, the vision that the Tibetan government had was, you guys are going to be the, you guys are going to represent the Tibetan collective in a new place called America. And you are going to represent us. You're not just going as, individuals with individual agency and motivations, but you're going to go there as our representative, and you're going to find a way to be able to contribute to your brethrens. And, people were very proud to be picked based off of those ideals. And, among the lottery system, the Tibetan government also wanted to send the brightest and the best, working in the Tibetan, institutions under the Tibetan government, because they wanted strong, trustable individuals to be able to lead communities over in a totally new frontier. I see the U.S. as a new frontier for the Tibetan community diaspora. So because they sent the brightest and the most promising, exile in South India experienced brain drain. That's how they described it. So, but I do think these strong personalities, if you I don't know, I don't know who these personalities were specifically, but if you were to interview these people, I think they're still motivated by the same goals that they were entrusted with. And they continue to actually be on that path that the Tibetan government allowed them to be on and for them to be part of. It's something that they're still proud of. It's something that you cannot take away from them, regardless of the fact that these were professionals, who were like highly educated at the time for them, in their exile context, and these were doctors and teachers, nurses and government civic officials, who came to the United States and were placed in dishwashing, janitorial, labor-intensive jobs that were completely out of what they trained for. That wasn't necessarily highly thought out, and they didn't question it, even though they thought it was weird and off that they were not being placed in positions that they have long CVs in. They were they unquestionably took that and decided to make something out of it, you know, and that's something that I don't know, like I'm capable of doing, you know, of all this education that I've received, and to be placed in dishwashing positions is so demeaning. But you know, I don't know if, but the level of humility that they demonstrated it's amazing, and all of it had to do with the motivation, and I think they haven't lost sight. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I start? So, do I think it was successful? I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask my father, was it successful? I think he would point to me and say, yeah, it was successful. Do I think it was successful? In many ways, yes, because I think I'm doing work that is extremely rewarding for me. I think it's work that my father can feel proud of. Can I actually? I want to just feel this and then talk. I don't really want this on camera. Success stuff, I think success is subjective. It's hard to point to. I think numbers are also subjective. I think it depends on who you ask. And I think some people will say, personally speaking, some people will say it was a success. And other people will say, I don't know if it was a success for me, at least, you know. I think in my own family's experience, I think that for my father it was, for me it was. And I think that's because in many ways, even though I, you know, decided what I was going to do with my life and the kind of opportunities that I was going to take part in, and like I thought, I was under the impression that I was entirely in control of my own life's trajectory, and in many ways I am. But I think having experienced, having lived the impacts of the resettlement project, you know, and having experienced, you know, both really positive and negative outcomes, and experiencing it, observing it, in the long run, I think you would have gotten a different answer from me if I was a teenager, you know. Now that I'm an adult and, you know, conducting my own life and my professional aspirations, you know, I'm arriving at this project. I'm doing a project that is actually about the larger Tibetan exile community's dreams and hopes for the future, and you know, and so like, if I think of myself in the context of the kind of dreams that people who were actually thinking about when they were actually thinking about making a resettlement project happen, the kinds of hopes and dreams that they had, do I match that? You know, well, I think the kind of work that I'm doing, in many ways, yes, it aligns, regardless of whether I thought I was actually following their trajectory or not. I actually wasn't. I haven't thought about resettlement projects since I was a teenager, actually. So, in many ways, I think I am a success story, if you want to call it that. But I think I am the result of a lot of sweat, you know, blood and tears, literally blood and tears, of the kind of work that these people were doing back in the day. And not just people, like literally communities. Both, you know, for me, it's the Dharamsala community and the Boston community. In many ways, yeah. So in many ways, I think that, you know, this is an effort of people not just the people who organized it, who dreamed it, who worked for it, and who actually materialized it, but also the people who were the bodies and the numbers and the counts that actually came here and made a Tibetan community in Boston, for example, happen. And I think my ideas about, you know, what it is to be Tibetan, what does it mean to be who I am, what it means to be a member of this evolving community, and like my ideas about personal responsibility and how I think about the larger Tibetan community. The fact that I even belong to one, you know, it's a privilege that not a lot of people have. And I think it's highly shaped by these human stories that we're trying to be communities in very hard times.